begin. So I'm happy to open this meeting of our research seminar, already the sixth in this year, in which Anna Erlwein will speak to us. She came to us from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She came for the full year as a visiting researcher. So you can have more opportunities to meet her here before we saw already in our research seminars. Dr. Erlwein obtained her PhD in Islamic intellectual history from the SOAS University in London in 2016. Her book, based on her PhD thesis, is called "Arguments for God's Existence in Classical Islamic Thought: A Reappraisal of the Discourse," which was appeared in 2019. Having done several years of postdoctoral research, she's currently, as I said, a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck in the group which is called Experience in the Premodern Science of Soul and Body, circa 800 to 1650. And her research focuses on investigating the role of experience in the Islamic science of Kalam, which is kind of theology, and falsafa, philosophy. Subject on which he published articles in journals and collections in related fields. And her talk, as you can see, is Unscientific Methods, Debating Analogical Reasoning in the Premodern Islamic Tradition.
So I hope everybody can hear me. Yeah, first of all, thanks so much everybody for coming. It's very nice to see everybody here. And thanks to Shaul for giving me the opportunity to speak here and present on a research topic of mine. So yeah, as the title says, I want to talk today about analogical reasoning, which was a frequently used mode of reasoning in a pre-modern Islamic tradition. And it was also a mode of reasoning which historical actors theorized about and which they explicitly discussed with each other. And so in investigating analogical reasoning, I actually have a broader concern or broader question in mind, which is I'm interested in asking how, according to these historical actors, scientific knowledge could be attained. So which methods are there, according to them, or forms of reasoning that can yield scientific knowledge? And of course, as you can imagine, in asking this question, you could actually look at all sorts of methods or forms of reasoning. So one could look at induction, one could look at experiment, deduction, whatever. But there is a reason that I'm interested or fascinated in analogical reasoning, which is that I think it actually allows telling a very interesting story about changing norms and values of science. And it tells us something about different paradigms in which these historical actors were operating when they were doing their scientific inquiry. And so I want to give you a little insight in this story of analogical reasoning. And maybe what we could say is, if this were a theater play, it would have 3 acts. So the first one would be looking at the early theological tradition. So the name is Kalam in Arabic. And what we will find here is that these theologians were frequently making use, as I said, of analogical reasoning and debating it. Then the second act would be on Ibn Sina, the great philosopher Ibn Sina, Islamic tradition, who introduced notions of basically who introduced Greek understandings of science and logic into Islam, and who led to a denigration of analogical reasoning. And then the third act, and the final one, would be the impact that Ibn Sina's ideas about analogical reasoning and about science had on the Kalam tradition. And that's kind of the story I want to tell today. And obviously, I would welcome afterwards any questions and comments. I'm very interested to hear what you think about this topic and what ideas or inspiration you have. And this is especially so because I would like to write a book on this topic. So it would be nice to discuss this a little bit with you. And then also actually Ahmed Iqbali and I, we just submitted a proposal for the Israel Science Foundation, which if it gets accepted. We could do a research project on analogical reasoning. So keeping that in mind, it would be nice to kind of hear what you think about this topic. Okay, so before I say something about the pre-modern Islamic context, I want to do a little excursion into the context of European science or the European scientific tradition. And I think this is interesting because as many of you will know, and I don't know exactly what scientific or academic backgrounds you come from, but many of you will know that analogical reasoning was also used quite a lot in the European scientific tradition. And there were similar debates about how analogy should be used, what problems are associated with it, that we will find in the Islamic tradition as well. And so I thought it would be interesting to do this little excursion. So I want to give you one example here. Many of you will know it, Galileo Galilei. So he basically made use in his like scientific endeavors of analogical reasoning. There's one famous one. So as many of you will know, Galileo used a telescope and observed the surface, or he observed the moon. And actually here you can see a drawing that he made. And so basically what he found was, as we can all see, that there's dark and light spots on the surface of the moon. And he tried to explain this phenomenon. And so what he did was he was drawing an analogy to the surface of the Earth. Because as we know from the surface of the Earth, whenever we have dark and light spots, it is because there's mountains and valleys, and in some of them you find light, and in others there is darkness. So what Galileo did was he argued that an analogy to this phenomenon on the Earth, it must be the same with the moon. And I think this is a very interesting example of analogical reasoning in the European scientific tradition, because basically, you know, at the time they had this worldview that, or rather not worldview, but this view that the heavenly bodies are perfect spheres. And so what Galileo did with his analogical reasoning is that he was overthrowing the theory, because now he argued that the moon wasn't actually this perfectly round sphere, but that we had, like on Earth, like valleys and mountains there. So I think this is an interesting example. I'm going to give you another example, which some of you might know as well, which is the physicist Enrico Fermi. He was actually among the first, the creators of the first nuclear reactor. And so he wrote an article in which he wrote that he wants to construct a theory of the emission of neutrinos and electrons from the nucleus in analogy to the theory of the emission of a light quantum from an excited atom. So I'm not a physicist. I have no idea what he's talking about here. But obviously what's interesting is that he said explicitly that he's using analogical reasoning between a known theory or theory that he has already come up with in order to construct a new theory. So also when you just think about it, generally the language that we also use nowadays in science, it is analogical. Like for example, in physics, we speak about the electrical current. So the word current is obviously taken from a different context originally. We speak about a magnetic field. That's all analogical language. Or like in biology, for example, we have the idea of a phylogenetic tree, or we know of bottleneck evolution. And I'm sure from, like, you can think of many more such terms or the language that's used in science from other fields that are basic analogies. But obviously the history of analogical reasoning is much, much older than like what we've talked about now here with the European scientific tradition. And it actually goes back all the way to Aristotle, who was the first to theorize about this. So in the very beginning, Aristotle used the analogy in order to refer to ratios and mathematics, and then, you know, it became used for other sorts of analogies as well. And so I think what this shows is, and by the way, the secondary literature makes this very clear as well, is that analogical reasoning definitely has its place in science. But what's debated is what exactly is its function? So what exactly can it do in science? And so some people have argued that it is actually essential to science, for example, as a method of discovery. And so there's a quote by the geologist Prof. Carl Gilbert, who died in 1918, and he said, hypotheses are always suggested through analogy. But then there's other views as well that say that what analogy can do in science is that it can be explanatory, or it can be an illustrative device, but it is definitely not enough for giving a justification of a scientific claim. So I think this is important because, as I said, like, it's clear that analogy has its place in science, but it's not so clear what exactly can it do. Okay, and so this is basically, in a way, or these are the questions that I'm also interested in looking at the pre-modern Islamic tradition. And so, as I said, I want to start with the first act, which is looking at analogical reasoning in the early Islamic theology, Kalam. So that would be about the 9th to the 11th century. And so first of all, what I want to say is, I think we need to be clear about here the historical conception of what theology as a science, obviously science understood in the way these historical actors understood it, what theology is all about. What were theologians trying to do in terms of their scientific activity? So they started from the assumption that when it comes to religious dogmas or to faith, blind adherence to what religious authorities tell you is not acceptable. Because they were saying, why should you believe what one person tells you about what's orthodoxy rather than what another one does, if there is no criterion for making sure that one is saying the truth and the other one is not? So what they said was that their science is concerned with scrutinizing religious dogma and actually resting religious dogma on a reason-based foundation. They wanted to present proof for belief, for dogmas. And so they said that what they're doing is to produce knowledge, and this is of course different from mere supposition, which they said one has if one blindly follows some religious authority. And this is very important to keep in mind now when we're discussing analogical reasoning, because for them, analogical reasoning was one such way to knowledge. It was one way of proving religious doctrines and one way that could bring about knowledge in this specific context of theology. And so there's one particular form of analogy that they use, which I translated here as being between observable phenomena and phenomena which are non-observable. Here's also the transliteration of the Arabic terms they used for those who are interested in that. So the idea was that when you look around in the world, there's many things that obviously we can observe by our senses and we can have knowledge about them, and they can help us know something about all these entities that theology is concerned with that are beyond our senses, like obviously God, or questions about, which I wrote down here, this hotly debated topic of the origin of the world. And so actually this problem now is something I want to focus on. So I quickly want to tell you what the theologians were debating here. So they were very interested in the question whether the world has always existed or whether it came about at a certain point in the past. And the reason they were interested in this was because obviously there was their interpretation of the Quran, the Holy Scripture, but also they wanted to show that God was the one who brought about the world. So a certain notion of God as the creator of the world. And so it was important for them to prove that the world has an origin in time so that they could show God is its creator, God made it. And so that's, as I said, what I want to focus on now in talking about analogical reasoning. And here I just want to give you two quotes from two early theologians. One is called Al-Maturidi, he died in 944, and the other one is called Al-Ash'ari, he died in 936. And so I'm going to read the first one to you. So Maturidi said, a writing points to a writer, and the same is the case with the world and everything that is in it. It points to some originator. And this is also the case with buildings, weaving, carpentry, and all the other arts. So what is Maturidi doing here? He wants to make the point or prove the dogma that the world really is originated and brought about by God. How does he do it? He does it by making an analogy to certain observable phenomena. In this case, he's saying that something written, we all know obviously, doesn't just pop into existence, but it has somebody who writes it down. It has a writer. The same with buildings. Buildings don't just pop into existence. They don't bring about themselves, but they also are made by somebody, and so on. And so this is the analogy he's drawing. Now let's have a look at Ash'ari. Ash'ari says, so he's asking the question, what is the proof that there is for creation a creator? And I want to emphasize or bring your attention to the word proof here. And then he says, it is this. he who sees in front of him only a wasteland where there is no castle, but then expects clay to turn into a different state, namely into bricks, and to stack themselves on top of each other without a maker or builder, he's ignorant. So you get the same reasoning here, right? Ash'ari is trying to argue just as much as we evidently all know that buildings never come about by themselves, but that they need an external cause, they need a maker. The same must also be true of the world. The world also needs to have a creator. And again, to emphasize, the function here of this analogical reasoning is first of all to provide a proof for religious dogma, and second of all, in their view, it yields actual knowledge, and thereby you can get rid of pure supposition. And what I also would like to point out is that there is a saying that every time has its specific analogy, and I think this is very true. And what you can already see here is that these early theologians, they use certain analogies like as a topos, it was like a typical example they gave, and that definitely had a proclivity for things like buildings and writings and so on, and all the human arts basically, or human artifacts. So what we can take away from this is that among these premodern theologians, there was a general agreement that analogical reasoning is useful in their science. But there was also disagreement about them, about the criteria that would guarantee the validity of this analogical reasoning they use. And in particular, it's this question of what entity 1 can tell us about entity 2. And I called it here entity 1 and entity 2. That's not how they would call it. Actually, your talk about morph 1 and 2 kind of inspired me here a little bit, so thanks for that. So what I want to say by this is that since analogical reasoning is always between two things, let's just put these placeholders, entity 1 and 2. But yeah, basically they were disagreeing about that, and were debating how exactly should we use analogical reasoning? What can it do for us? And here I want to give you one example of their debate. So when we're looking at a text or book written by the theologian Erlwein, he died in 1085, he reports on the disputes between two theological schools, namely the Ash'arites and the Mu'tazilites, about Al-Ash'ari's use of analogical reasoning. So you remember, Al-Ash'ari was the guy here with the castle. And so the Ash'arites is the theological school that followed him, and the Mu'tazilites are a rivaling theological school. So these schools were debating about this analogical reasoning we just saw. And the Mu'tazilites were putting forward a critique. So what they were saying is, Al-Ash'ari subscribed to the occasionalist theory of causality. I don't know if everybody knows what occasionalist theory of causality is, but it's basically the idea that there's only one true cause in the whole universe, which is God. So we humans might have the impression that we are bringing about things, like when I lift this cup, I think it's me doing this. But according to occasionalism, this is basically an illusion. In reality, it is God who does everything in the universe. God kind of makes me, in a way, do this. I mean, it's a bit complicated, but you have to keep in mind that basically, according to this theory of causality, humans are no true agents. We don't really have agency, and the only agent, the only true agent is God. So now, the Mu'tazilis were saying, this is the theory of causality Ash'ari subscribed to. But this had consequences for his use of analogical reasoning, because they said, if humans aren't really the ones who build these buildings, if we are not really the ones that bring about the buildings, because really it is God, right? Then the analogy between humans as builders and God as the one who made the world basically fails. Because they were saying either it means that there is no proof at all or no knowledge attainable that God really is the creator. Because if we don't really do what we think we do, then we cannot say that this is an analogy for God. Or the other consequence is, if we say there really is an analogy between the fact that to us it seems like we are agents, but really we are not, then this must also be true of God. But then we have a weird conception of God as creator, which the theologians don't really want. The theologians want to say God really is the true creator of the world, but they cannot do this if they're believing in occasionalism. And so I think this is actually a nice example, as I said, of these theologians all agreed, yes, let's use analogical reasoning. They also said, yes, let's use the analogy between humans and God, that's fine. But they were debating about the details and under which conditions does an analogy become valid and can function as a proof and as bringing about knowledge, and under which conditions is it not able to do that. Okay, so much about these early theologians. Now we can move on to Islamic philosophy, which in Arabic is called falsafa. And as I said, I want to focus here on the great Ibn Sina. He's probably the greatest philosopher in the Islamic tradition, depends on who you ask. And so again, what's interesting about him is he really caused a dethronement, if you want to say, or maybe a downfall of analogical reasoning in the theological tradition. And there's two reasons for this. As I said earlier, what Ibn Sina did was he introduced this paradigm of Aristotelian logic and a Greek Aristotelian understanding of science into the Islamic tradition. So what this meant was, he said that the gold standard of science is demonstration. You know, demonstration is when you say all A are B and so on. So when you speak in these universals, you make statements that are universally true of everything. Because according to him and Aristotle, these demonstration and these universal statements would bring about certainty. And certainty is what science is seeking. Certainty only comes about when you can give a reason why the things are like they are. So science is definitely not interested in only correlations or something like this, to use our modern parlance. It's also not interested in accidental features of things that could be different. No, science wants to understand why exactly is it that the things are the way they are. So it's always trying to discover the reason why. So that was the standard or the paradigm of science within which Avicenna was, or Ibn Sina was operating. And according to him, analogical reasoning did not live up to that standard. So that's the first reason. But the second reason he caused a downfall of analogy in theology and so on, this other science, was that Ibn Sina had an enormous influence on this theological tradition. I mean, you could say, well, it shouldn't really matter what Ibn Sina and his other science and philosophy says, if it weren't for the fact that the theologians were very much influenced by him. So we see that in all sorts of discussions, but it's definitely also true when it comes here to analogical reasoning. Okay, so let's see what he has to say. So as I said, what he did was applying the Aristotelian logic, and especially what Aristotle has to say about analogy, which is usually here referred to as the paradigm or the example, to the theological analogy. And here's some quotes from Ibn Sina. So he wrote quite a few works, and in different works he discusses this topic slightly differently, but let's look at those. So, for example, in one of his works, he says, the paradigm is when a judgment is made about something non-observable, as the same judgment exists in an observable example. So what I want to draw your attention to is, first of all, when he talks about analogy, he uses this word paradigm, and in Arabic, literally, it is giving an example, which is the Aristotelian way of thinking about analogy. But he mixes this with these terms non-observable and observable, which, as we saw earlier, are exactly the way the theologians talked about analogical reasoning. So I think it's safe to say, when Ibn Sina wrote this, he actually had the theologians in mind and what they were doing. In another text of his, he writes that analogy is the judgment about a particular thing based on the existence of the same judgment in another particular thing. And he gives us an example. He says, the paradigm is the world must be originated because it is a body composed of parts. And so it resembles a building. And buildings are originated, therefore the world must also be originated. I think, having seen what these two theologians, Maturidi and Ash'ari, had to say about analogy and which examples they used, it's quite evident that Ibn Sina really is referring to them. It's exactly the same example, this analogy between buildings and the world. Now, what is his critique? Here's an example of how he criticizes analogy. He said, this argument is often used in politics and theology, and I think he's right to point out that also politicians like to use it. But the judgment to be transferred from entity 1 to entity 2 is never certain. This is so because it is possible that a judgment about one class of particulars, so that would be entity 1, is contrary to a judgment about a class of similar particulars, so there would be this entity 2. For there are many things which are like each other in some respect and unlike each other in other respects. So what is he trying to do? What is he criticizing here exactly? So he's saying, why should a certain similarity between entity 1 and entity 2 justify the transfer of judgment between them? And maybe I can give an example to make this a bit more like clearer. So this is an example that doesn't come from Ibn Sina, but I think it's a nice one. So imagine something like this. The sun shines bright, the moon also shines bright. The sun produces its own light. Therefore, the moon must also produce its own light. Well, we know this is a false analogy, right? And this is what he's trying to say. He's trying to say only because two things are similar in one respect, it doesn't mean that they're similar in all respects. So it's easy for him to get an analogy to get something wrong. And so keep in mind that what he wants to raise the standards of science, and he wants to get certainty. He wants to be certain about a scientific claim. And he just thinks analogy can't give you that. So Ibn Sina then tells us that actually some of the theologians, they were kind of aware that analogy in theology is maybe a little bit problematic. And so they're trying to find a way around this and actually to get closer to this idea of certainty. And he says that what they were trying to do is provide a reason why their transfer of judgment by analogy should be valid. So he says, here's a chapter on sophistic reasoning from observable to non-observable. So again, this is clearly the theological analogy, observable, unobservable. But I would like to point out that he speaks here about sophistic reasoning. And as we all know, the term sophist is used for somebody who pretends to have a good argument, but doesn't really have to. So he's clearly making a statement here. So he says, the sophists used analogical reasoning until they were forced to accept that the argument does not yield necessary conclusions. Some try to defend the argument by claiming that they were providing a reason why, and this is supposed to give us certainty. For example, they reasoned, there is a maker of every house. Then they looked at the sky and observed that it was a body with form and shape, and they said that it too is something that has a maker. However, they did not say the sky must be made because it is similar to a house, kind of analogical reasoning here. For they knew that things which have some things in common do not necessarily have all things in common. That's exactly the problem he just pointed out, right? Instead, they asserted that the reason why they could say that the house is made is that it is a body with form and shape. So I know this is maybe a little bit complicated. Basically, what he's saying is, the theologians try to defend their analogy and say, no, it's justified by saying that the similarity between the two things they're comparing an analogy isn't just a random thing. They were saying that they were able to identify the relevant connection between, the similarity and the judgment that is to be transferred from one thing to the other. And the way they argued this here is that they're saying basically that was the sky and a building have in common is that they are body with form and shape. So they're corporeal, the body with form and shape. And they're arguing that since they are like this, it's justified to say that they have a maker. We know this from a building, and so an analogy, it must be true of the sky as well. I hope the idea is becoming clear here. So Ibn Sina, as you can imagine, isn't convinced. He still thinks that analogy is a weak argument. So that's what he says. The argument is very weak. He gives quite a few reasons in this text, and I definitely don't want to mention all of them, but I want to give you a little impression. So he said, okay, what about this? Maybe what applies to a house does not actually apply to other similar entities like the sky. Maybe the house is just completely unique and one of its kind. So if this were the case, what would this imply? It would imply that the house and the sky might both be bodies with shape and form, as we saw the theologians argued, but it doesn't matter, so to say, because maybe only in a house, the fact that the house has a body and with shape and form implies that it has a maker. Maybe the house is unique in this. And maybe even though the sky also has a shape and a form, it doesn't mean that this means it has a maker. So if Ibn Sina's argument or his critique is valid, of course, again, the conclusion is to say, or what it implies is that analogy simply has an uncertain basis. It's not good enough for science. Another critique he puts forward is that he says, finding this reason why requires knowing all the properties of your entity one, in this case, the house. But so in order to identify those properties which are relevant for the transfer of judgment by analogy. But then Ibn Sina says, but not all properties of an entity are observable to all people at the same time. So it's like saying, maybe having form and shape is not actually the relevant criterion for saying that something is made. Maybe the things have some property we are not even aware of that are the reason that something is made by a creator, and we're just missing out on this. Again, same implication. Analogy is a problematic form of reasoning. So this leads Ibn Sina then to conclude, but even though analogy can never give us certainty, it can provide us with some kind of satisfaction. So it can never give us certainty. Again, not good enough for science, but it can give us some sort of satisfaction. And I think what he means by this is precisely that in politics, it is a useful rhetorical and persuasive argument. And I mean, as we still see nowadays, politicians do like to use it. But again, the important point is that in science, it really has no place. But I think there's also an interesting implication now here. Basically, if it doesn't have a place in science, then it raises the question, what is theology according to Ibn Sina? It's certainly not a proper science because the theologians are using it. Okay, so this much on Ibn Sina. Now I want to move on to the last act of our little story here, which is looking at the post-Avicennan tradition of theology and what they said about analogical reasoning. Because as I already said, what Ibn Sina said about analogy had a huge impact on these later theologians. And I've chosen Al-Ghazali as an example. So there could be others as well. There could be interesting case studies. I want to talk about him. Maybe you've heard his name before. Ghazali was a theologian who was very critical of the philosophers, of the Islamic philosophers. He even wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he accuses them of holding certain doctrines or beliefs that he even considers un-Islamic. So he thinks they're not really Muslims in this regard and get religion basically wrong. But it's also interesting about Ghazali that at the same time in other texts of his, he did adopt actually a lot of concepts and ideas coming from philosophy. He basically incorporated them into his own theological thought and also changed some things that previous theologians said and so on. And I think the same can be seen now when it comes to logic, especially with what he has to say about analogical reasoning. And I want to show you that. Okay, so there's one work by him, Miyat al-Ilm, and there's a section on logic. And there he writes, section on the paradigm. Again, it's the same word, tamsil, that Ibn Sina was using and which is inspired by the Greek tradition. And it's not the same name that the theologians use. But he says then, this is what the theologians call relating to the non-observable to the observable. So again, he also brings together Greek logic with what the theologians did. Then he says its definition is this: a judgment which exists on one particular thing is transferred to another particular thing which resembles the other one in some way. Okay, we already know that. Okay, now what he does is the following. He actually picks up Ibn Sina's critique. For Ghazali, analogical reasoning also cannot yield certainty. And he has the same problem with it that Ibn Sina had, which is that he thinks the connection between the judgment we want to transfer and this shared property between the two entities is uncertain. So he says the following. The theologians argued, the heavens are originated because they are corporeal, in analogy to plants and animals, which are corporeal and whose originatedness can be observed. Okay, great, we know that already. I, Al-Ghazali, however, say this analogical reasoning is not sound, as long as it cannot be established beyond doubt that plants are originated precisely because they're corporeal. So what is this critique? He's saying what you need in order to draw an analogy between the heavens and animals and plants, and in order to argue that the heavens are originated just as much as plants and animals are, you need to be certain that the reason for being originated is that something is corporeal, so in a sense is material, has extension space. So he says, as long as you can't be 100% sure that corporeality implies originatedness, this analogical reasoning is not sound. This is kind of what Ibn Sina in a way also said. He then goes on, and he actually follows Ibn Sina, and Ghazali then says basically that certainty about the claim that, which is here the essential one, that plants are originated precisely because they are corporeal, can only be achieved if it is universally established that corporeality implies originatedness. So, and this universally should ring a bell here, because we said earlier about Ibn Sina, who came from the Greek logical tradition, and he basically said what science is looking for is universal statements. Statements which are always true, which are necessary. And this is what Ghazali is picking up now here. But this view has, again, implications for using analogical reasoning. I want to show you what he says. Okay, so if this were established beyond doubt, namely this connection between corporeal and being originated, it would be a universal statement or judgment. And one could simply say, the heavens are corporeal, everything that is corporeal is originated, consequently the heavens are originated. This would now be correct, he says, but it also means that mentioning some particular observable thing would cease to be relevant. And so mentioning animals would be superfluous. There is then no benefit in singling out an observable thing in order to use it as an analogy. So what is he doing here? He's saying we need to be in analogy certain about that this transfer of judgment from one thing to the other is justified. In order to get the certainty, we need a universal statement. Once we have that, which is here the one I've highlighted, the one everything that is corporeal is originated, we can basically just make use of a deductive argument. If we know that everything that is corporeal is originated, and we know that the heavens are corporeal, then we know with certainty that the heavens are originated. This is what we wanted to prove. But if we can use deduction, then analogy is completely irrelevant. Why, if we know that generally everything that is corporeal is originated, why should we then use plants or animals or anything else as an example in order to use the analogy? So this is why he thinks that analogy is superfluous, and basically he wants to replace it by deduction. I had another example here, but I think the point has hopefully become clear, and I'm gonna jump this and go to Ghazali's conclusion of this whole discussion about analogy. Basically, he ends this whole discussion by saying, all this shows how mistaken analogical reasoning is in rational matters. It's just not useful. And then he adds that at best, analogical reasoning can make us aware of something. And I think this also rings the bell from what we heard about Ibn Sina, right? When he said, it can give us some satisfaction. We can use it to kind of get a hint of certain connections between things, but it's definitely not enough for science. And so I want to end by just saying again, I hope by kind of running through quite a few centuries of Islamic intellectual history, that nevertheless it has become clear that what we're witnessing here with Ghazali is a clear break with the theological tradition. So for him, following Ibn Sina and being inspired by Ibn Sina's critique of analogy, he now thinks that analogical reasoning is no longer a method that can yield scientific knowledge. And it also doesn't function as a proof in the science of Kalam anymore. This is a clear break with what we saw, how these earlier theologians like Ash'ari and Maturidi, how they thought about analogical reasoning. And as I said, I find this fascinating because we could see how this shift in the perception of analogical reasoning was very much influenced by shifts in paradigms of science. So once the paradigm of Greek science came into the Islamic world and became more and more prominent, it meant that the way they thought about scientific methods and forms of reasoning also shifted. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And thanks so much for your attention. Toda raba, shukran. And yeah, I very much look forward to your thoughts on this and questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Now, since I'm not familiar with much of the history of the development of the Islamic thought, I was wondering if there is any relevance to the places in which these thoughts were developed and the sects within Islam within which these thinkers and philosophers worked. I mean, if it was Shiite or Sunni, I was wondering if that explains shifts or differences in their development.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account, especially their affiliation with like theological groups, or so what you said about Sunni and Shi'i. I have to say, I'm not an expert on Shi'i theology, so I have actually no idea how exactly the Shi'is treated analogy. Maybe, I mean, I know there's some other Islamic studies professors here, maybe they would like to jump in. But yeah, their affiliation with certain groups definitely played a role. So for example, I give you one more example where you can see that. Much later, there was a scholar called Ibn Taymiyyah, and he actually belonged to a very traditionalist camp. So what I mean by this is, these scholars were opposed to the whole Kalam, I mean, theology enterprise in the first place. They thought like all this talking about rational arguments is wrong in the first place. Reason cannot give you knowledge about religious matters, only the revelation can. And so it's actually interesting because Ibn Taymiyyah therefore criticizes all of these theologians, all of these philosophers, that you all got it completely wrong. In fact, the Quran itself, according to him, uses analogical reasoning, and therefore we should use it, right? So what I want to say about this example is that Ibn Taymiyyah's attitude is a different one because he has a very different approach to this whole question of rational arguments and which role the Quran plays in all of this. So with all these people I talked about, the theologians and also the philosophers, I mean, they all thought that reason plays an important role in gaining knowledge. That has become clear. So I think that's kind of what, as I said, like what keeps them together in their general view on this, but it's more with them whether they belong to the theological camp or the philosophical one, whether they think analogy is used or not, so to say. I hope
so they were all Sunnis and and they all worked in the same geographical kind of locale, or
yeah, kind of. I mean, at least in the east. So these people I talked about, they were not in the west of the empire. So I mean, at the time of Ibn Sina, there was a lot of exchange already. You know, like when it comes to the early theologians, like for example, Maturidi and Ash'ari, the ones I mentioned, I think they didn't know of each other. Maturidi was living in Samarkand, Ash'ari was living in Baghdad, in Basra, and this was really the beginnings of theology. They didn't know of each other, which again is interesting because they're using the same arguments, which means the arguments are going back to an earlier source, actually. Yeah.
Aviram?
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and very coherent talk. I have 2 points. The first pertains to the example that you gave of Galileo, where you say that Galileo used analogical reasoning to describe the surface of the moon.
Yeah.
The way I see it, Galileo is simply observing. He has a telescope. He's able to resolve the surfaces and observe mountains, and hills, and valleys, and shades. So it's not that there is any real work here being done by analogy. He's simply observing better than anyone before the surface of the moon. And you can say it's an analogy in the sense that we had to know that mountains on Earth cast
an observation, but I think it's this thing where previous knowledge you have about one thing, namely the surface of the Earth, confirms for you that what you're seeing up there. That's how I understood it, but I guess maybe you know more about Galileo.
Out here. Galileo observed areas which were darker and lighter on the moon. That was his observation. His conclusion that these are valleys and mountains, etc., the conclusion coming, it needed some kind of inference. You can say that this analogy is not very strong one, but he used also some analogy there, but it's inferring. So it's not that you observe and you see mountains. You see areas which are darker, areas which are lighter, and then you have to interpret it.
And if I could, thanks for this, and if I could maybe add one more thing, because you were saying that actually at the time, like the way you interpreted Galileo, this is already showing us that analogy is actually not a good argument, as Insina said, and that they were trying to get rid of it. I mean, when you think about somebody like Descartes, apparently Descartes was very much in favor of using analogy in physics, even to the point where, at least in some of his works, he writes, if somebody doesn't use analogy, I have demonstrative knowledge that his claim must be wrong. So I don't think that it's so clear that, first of all, that analogy doesn't have a place. Again, as I said, the question is what exactly can it do? But it's also not so clear that these thinkers back then were like that there was a trend that they were trying to get rid of it. I'm really not sure about that.
Maria Teresa?
Thank you for your presentation. I am also a visiting scholar here, and I'm also at the Max Planck Institute. It's funny that we
Oh.
met.
Also, and the one for history of science? Oh, really? Wow.
My question is about the translation and language.
Yeah.
Since I mean, I was trained in philosophy in Europe, so I read Avicenna through as a reader of Aristotle, and then as someone that influenced the Western tradition, so to say. So my question would be, as he interprets Aristotle and refers to analogy, does the Arabic language as an influence of the thought of Avicenna? And I mean, it is also a shift in translation shift, and he's inserting Aristotle in another tradition. So I'm thinking about this because I know that in other logical tradition, as for instance in the old Chinese philosophy, they do not have, for instance, logic principle as the non-contradiction principle, which is a kind of the most important or one of the most important principle in the Western logic. So I was wondering about this relationship, and this is also related to another question. Since you quoted at the beginning Galileo and Copernicus and so on, I was wondering if you are using European categories. So you mentioned now also Kuhn for interpreting Islamic tradition, or if you are comparing both tradition, or you are, or if you mentioned Galileo and Fermi only to do your talk perhaps more approachable for some of us that are not trained in Arabic.
Yeah, thanks so much for these questions. Okay, so again, I start with the second one. So I definitely included now in the talk Galileo and Fermi because I thought that probably the majority here is more familiar with the European tradition, and so that would be nice. But as I said, I find it also fascinating in talking about analogy that this is definitely not a subject that is only confined to the Islamic context, but this is something we find in many scientific traditions, and even it's debated even nowadays. So it's a topic with such a long history, and so I find this interesting to point out, and also to show that the questions that are being asked about analogy basically are very similar. Then this thing about using Western analytic categories to describe what I think is going on here in the Islamic context. Yes, of course, this is true. I mean, some words are used, like the paradigm shift is definitely an analytic category. It's not an actors category. You could even ask the question whether the word science here is appropriate to be used for this context. I know, Shaul, that you're not very much in favor for using it for these pre-modern contexts. I think it's something can be debated. I don't think it's necessarily a problem to use these analytic categories if they help us flesh out something and make it more understandable about these thoughts the actor said. But yes, I'm aware of that I'm using these categories. What was the other question?
What's the translation?
Yeah, okay. So you wanted to know about when Ibn Sina, since it was also a translation of Aristotelian logic into Arabic, whether the translation process had changed maybe certain ideas, something like this. Yeah, okay. So I'm not an expert on all the things Ibn Sina had to say in the realm of logic. He had a lot to say about this. But I know that obviously he tried to be quite faithful to Aristotle, who he saw as a important thinker in this respect. But I know from some research others have done on this that Ibn Sina also introduced quite some changes to the discipline of logic. He developed certain ideas further and changed also certain things you find in Aristotle. So one thing, for example, that definitely apparently it's a bit of a contradiction, but that underwent a change was, I think, this idea of certainty. That's very important here in the Arabic tradition. We don't really have this, or there is a debate whether we have this in the Aristotelian tradition. I don't know, I don't remember the Greek word, but maybe somebody can help, like this word, what is it? Sorry? That is used by Aristotle, which became rendered yaqeen in the Arabic tradition, which translates to certainty, and where it seems like this was actually a change or certain understanding of what Aristotle said that is not necessarily in the text. So unfortunately, I can only give you this example.
Thank you very much. Actually, I want to present kind of defense of analogy. Besides the fact that analogy is more creative for me, and it can produce a new knowledge. I think that the Muslim theologians faced a serious problem with the Aristotelian syllogism. And the problem is that this kind of syllogism is not fruitful. It doesn't yield anything new. What you have in the conclusion is already mentioned in the premises. So this is the problem, and they try to solve this problem by using this kind of analogy. And I think that they managed to create or to produce a new knowledge that was unknown to them. My question is, did you find or tackle any kind of combination between the two types of reasoning, the analogy and the syllogism?
The deduction?
The deduction.
Yeah. You mean the syllogism that Ghazali says you should use instead?
For instance, the premise or the two premises of a syllogism are based on analogical reasoning. So in the first stage, we use the analogical reasoning, and we make these the results of the conclusions as two premises, and then we conclude a new information about these two premises.
I'm not entirely sure I got exactly, but so you mean that deduction and yeah. So I mean, again, I can only think at the moment of Ibn Taymiyyah, who I mentioned earlier, and I know you have worked on him as well. So again, just quickly, earlier I said that Ibn Taymiyyah thinks all this discussion is completely wrong. Both the theologians and the philosophers got it wrong. And so he said we should use analogy. But what he picks up from the theologian is to say, what he picks up from the philosophers like Ibn Sina to say, yes, we want certainty, definitely. But he said, analogy can give us certainty. Because, you know, this whole worry Ibn Sina had about like oh, analogy is only valid if you can be certain that this similarity between entity 1 and entity 2 is what allows the transfer of judgment. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, yeah, but we can have the certainty with many things. Like, what is the problem? Once we know that we have the certainty, then what is the problem with analogical reasoning? So for him, I think this was a combination of still using analogical reasoning as a mode of thinking. And I think you're right that he would have agreed with you that analogy is something how we humans think. It helps us to progress to new knowledge. It's how we think. And deduction isn't really how we think, according to him. But he thinks that even there you have this deductive element in the sense that, not deductive, but in the sense that you have universal statements in there. Like this link is a universal knowledge. I don't know if this makes it clear, but so I think he tries to combine both and tries to defend analogy based on that he thinks it can give you certainty.
He's talking about Ibn Taymiyyah. He's talking
Ibn
about
Taymiyyah.
jurisprudence.
He's talking about both. So again, so this is something I
practical science.
Yeah. So obviously I didn't mention that, but as many might know, also in Islamic jurisprudence or law, analogy was used a lot, and you had similar discussions there. And so while in law, many of these thinkers continued using it, they thought that in rational matters, so like Ghazali says, in theology, it's not valid. And Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, that's wrong. It's valid in both. You can use it both in law and in theology because it's kind of the same, basically.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very clear and interesting.
Thank you.
I have one comment and one question. For comment, I found it interesting that they chose specifically buildings for the analogy because I think that buildings and architectural domain of semantics were traditionally a metaphor for the universe in the East.
Yeah.
In Jewish, I know it from Jewish literature, but also from Babylonian and Egyptian literature. So I think it may not be accidental that they chose. And the question I wanted to ask is, if I'm not mistaken, Aristotle's writings began to be translated into Arabic before the time of the earlier theologians, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah.
So does it mean that they were not as widespread at the time, or why were they not aware of Aristotle?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. Thank you. And this is something I've been thinking about as well. And I need to do more research on this. But so, you know what I think is, so you're right, these texts, the Greek texts and also other texts, they were translated in the middle of the 9th century. And so, for example, Maturidi and Ash'ari, these two early theologians I showed you, they died in the middle of the 10th century. So texts were already available. So I think what might have been going on back then is that, again, these theologians were very opposed, or many of them were very opposed to the influx of ideas from cultures they considered foreign to Islam. Like, for example, we get some early texts, for example, by the philosopher Al-Kindi. He's also like he lived at the time when these translations were made, and he defends his philosophical activity. So he's a Muslim philosopher. He defends his philosophical activity against people who say it's non-Islamic. The Prophet didn't do those things. We shouldn't take these things from the Greeks. The Prophet told us everything we need to know. So I think that many of these early theologians simply did not want to deal with things that were coming from the outside. At the same time, it seems like they knew of certain discussions. So it's not possible, I mean, we know it from some text, but I think it's also not possible that in these centers of learning, there was no exchange between philosophically minded people.
The question of how do we know?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Response to Greek philosophy.
Yeah. And so I think the explanation I would kind of favor is that we see also based on the analogies these theologians are using, that again, they come from a paradigm, which is actually the Quranic way of arguing. So what I mean by this is, for example, also Ash'ari again. He uses the development of humans from, he says, you know, once humans were like a drop of sperm, then they developed into a blood clot, then like some shape and form, and then, you know, they basically grown human. He uses these arguments in order to, again, draw an analogy to the world and how all these processes have a creator and so on. This sort of argument is definitely taken from the Quran. It goes back to Quranic verses that mention exactly these examples. So I think for these theologians, their mindset, they were in the way they were thinking about proofs was very much inspired by what they found in the Quran. I think this is even supported by the fact that Ash'ari, again, he wrote a defense of theology, of the discipline of theology, again, against those people who say, no, 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 you must not do this. And in this defense, he makes the explicit point over and over again that he says, all these theologians are doing is explaining something that is already in the Quran in more detail. So this is how they were seeing themselves. And I think this is probably why in the early, the early theology, we don't find so much engagement with what the philosophers did. But again, that's the interesting thing about Ibn Sina, and like a lot of research has shown that Ibn Sina just had such an enormous impact, much more than other philosophers who came before him. There was another philosopher called Farabi, who also already wrote on analogy, but for some reason he didn't have the same influence. And so it took some time, basically, until the theologians started to really engage with these philosophical ideas.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but I will start with at least one or two together. It's what you said about Al-Ghazali and his critique, it seems to be also some kind of critiques against the place of observation in general, because in a way the early analogical reasoning is a kind of is a way to suggest an implicit claim. So they have an implicit claim. If you see something complicated in the world, someone made it. That's the claim.
Yeah.
But they don't put it like that. And even Sina said that they don't have enough evidence for that. And so Al-Ghazali goes farther, and then the question is whether can we reach some kind of certainty for observation? And because if we not, so that makes like it's not only against analogical reasoning, it's just against observation.
Yeah, thank you. You're making a really good point, and actually I wrote an article on this question, so I've thought a little bit about it. I would say like what the way you framed it is exactly right. So it seems like with the use of analogical reasoning by the early theologians, which was, there's a reason they called it from observable phenomena to non-observable one. It shows that they thought much higher of observation of the world. Again, with Ibn Sina, this definitely changes. And again, even there we see his impact on a later theological tradition. Like, for example, so Ibn Sina discusses different methods which all have their starting point in experience. Like there's, for example, also one is called Tajriba, which is often translated also as experiment. And let's put it differently. Ibn Sina criticizes induction. The problem with induction, we all know, right? Only because you observe a series of things doesn't mean that the next thing is exactly the same. He criticizes this. He tries to oppose it with his own version of induction, which is the Tajriba thing. And he tries to find a way of making this more certain. So he tries to find a way to give room to observation and experience of the world that can still somehow yield certainty. But for him, the certainty is not a fully universal one, which he wants, but it's confined to a certain context. But this thinking, again, had an influence, again, on the theologians. And so what you can also see is when you look at their writings about metaphysics, this whole thing was like proving the creator. So while the early ones use all these observations and experiences of the world to prove that God made the world, the later ones like to use metaphysical concepts that have nothing to do with observation. Like concepts like, oh, everything, the whole world is possible in terms of its existence. And something possible needs something that brought it about. So there must be a necessary cause. So this is basically leaving behind, looking around in the world and inferring from this something and going more to these lofty universal metaphysical concepts. So I think this is exactly right, that the perception of what experience of the world can give you also shifted. And maybe analogy is just yet another version of that.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very interesting.
Thank
I'm
you.
not familiar with the subject, and it was very easy to follow.
Oh, thank you.
It's very nice. I want to ask, maybe we already addressed it, we talked about shifting paradigms, but
Yeah.
you also mentioned at the beginning that this is a shift of the values as well. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you could elaborate more on what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I spoke about changing scientific norms and values. Again, yeah, you caught me. This is yet another analytic category and not a actors category. But yeah, I mean it in that sense that scientific norms, like how should we do science, and scientific values, what are we trying to achieve in science? And so, like, yeah, this question, like, should we use analogy or not, is the scientific norms and values in a sense. For example, what does science want to do? It wants certainty, or it wants a proof, and these sorts of things. That's what I meant by that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I found a big part of the talk was to present how Ibn Sina as a philosopher changed the way tolerance works. Is it real? Is it the only example that you can see that Ibn Sina changed the world, or is it, or did he have some criticism and this is only one thing?
You mean, are there other things where Ibn Sina was critical of what the theologians were
Yeah,
doing?
and then the future theologians changed their ways according to his criticism.
Yeah, so the philosophical tradition and the theological tradition, there were in many respects very different, like especially when it comes to certain doctrines they subscribe to. Like, for example, I mentioned that Ghazali, this later theologian, wrote this book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he attacks them for certain doctrines they hold. So in many respects, Ibn Sina thought that the theologians before him went wrong. Like, for example, according to Ibn Sina, the world is eternal. Eternal through God and with God, but nevertheless eternal. It doesn't have a beginning in time. So when you read some of the things he says about that, you see he's attacking the theologians for their belief that the world has a beginning in time. Also, for example, Ibn Sina believed that, yeah.
Those philosophers then following the methodology didn't accept Ibn Sina.
Oh yeah, no, in that respect they didn't. Exactly, yeah,
So this
yeah.
is the only case where
No, not the only one. Okay, so with these things like the philosophers believe that the world is eternal, this is something that theologians definitely rejected, even though a friend of mine wrote her PhD on a scholar called Al-Amidi, and she argues there that maybe Amidi might have seen this a little bit differently. But anyways, generally speaking, this is something the theologians couldn't accept. But as I said, when I talked about the Ghazali, even though he was so opposed to philosophy, he also adopted a lot of their concepts and methods. Like, as I said earlier, for example, this whole idea about the possible existence, and then there's a necessary existence. This, again, comes from Ibn Sina. And other ideas like questions of causality. I talked about here how the early theologians were occasionalists. They thought there's only one cause in the universe, only God. And to think that we have agency is an illusion. Later ones were not so sure about this anymore. And yeah, so I think that what I showed here with analogical reasoning is just one of the many facets of where there was an exchange between them. Even though it seems to me that there was more that the theologians adopted from the philosophers and not as much as, I mean, the philosophers didn't adopt that much from the theologians, but I don't know, maybe this is something to be investigated.
Maybe it is important to mention that the logic after Ibn Sina was also introduced in Islamic traditional sciences.
Yeah.
For the first time, we have logic inside jurisprudence
Yes.
and science of grammar.
Yeah.
And this is thanks to the efforts of Ibn Sina. I think
Yeah.
that Ghazali was the first to initiate this this process in the science of jurisprudence.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I mean, I think what the theologians saw was that not everything a philosopher said was not useful for them. I mean, they saw there was a lot in what the philosophers said in terms of arguments and concepts that that the theologians could use for their own purposes. So in a way, even though there was always this opposition between the two sciences, there was also a lot of, you know, in a way, acknowledgement that your opponent developed useful theories so that you could adopt for your own purposes.
אני רושם את הרשום.
Okay.
Something that looks at the ratio between some corporate thing and the growth. And I was wondering if this could be have any implications in more mundane sciences.
Yeah.
Like, things that the relations between different creative entities, different corporate and the study of these things into the schools.
Yeah.
So this is my first question.
Yeah.
And the second question, if there wasn't any use of analogy in the Quran itself, but it's sort of indicated this.
Yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, the Quran definitely uses a lot of analogies. So again, the word analogy comes from a Greek word, right? But if we mean by this giving an example or giving something that is meant to say something about another thing that's kind of similar, the Quran is full of this. I mean, you could also say, yeah, it's giving like a likeness or resemblance. And in the Quran, I mean, the Quran says itself that it does this all the time. This is also why I said these early theologians like Ash'ari took their analogies from Quranic forms of argument and reasoning, definitely.
Then how could it be
That's a good question. So I think this might have to do with the fact that he thinks the Quran speaks in a way that is firstly addressed to lay people who are not as intelligent as the philosophers. This doesn't mean he has a negative view. So for him, this doesn't mean that he has a negative view of the Quran. He actually thinks that this is the quality of the Quran, which makes it so amazing, because the Quran manages to address all sorts of people, independent of, you know, whether they're like, you don't need to be a scholar in order to understand the Quran. So I want to emphasize for him, this is not negative, yeah? Yes, but science is something for the elite. Science is an elite activity. And so in that sense, if you want to do science, you should use different forms of reasoning and argument. I think that's why Ibn Sina goes away from these Quranic, I mean, that's one reason at least, why he goes. Yeah, okay, so analogy in other mundane sciences. In medicine, for example, there's a question of if in Islamic medicine analogy plays a role. Ibn Sina also was a physician, and he wrote this canon of medicine, quite a thick book, which apparently until like 17th century in Europe was still used as a textbook at universities. And he has a tiny chapter in there which also deals with analogical reasoning in medicine. And it's used apparently, but I think he's more in favor of experimentation. So, but there it plays a role as well. And then, as we were saying earlier, in jurisprudence, analogy always used to play, or still does play an important role, and was definitely much more accepted by these historical actors who were not just jurists, but also theologians, or theologians and also jurists, than it was in theology. Even though you can also find in jurisprudence big discussions about whether it should be used or not, but it was more accepted. Yeah. Thank you.
On the topic of observation and
Yeah.
learning about the world, you focus on two traditions like Kalam and Erlwein. I think that we should add another third tradition, is the natural philosophy, which was emerging then, like in Haytham. And for him, observation could lead us to certain.
Okay.
And he says in a letter while he was 660 or after his optics project, he says that my main goal is proximity to God. And I studied religion, and through religion, I didn't find any way to reach my goal. I found that the only way is by observation and reasoning, like Aristotle. So mainly you have a third tradition that maybe doesn't see the Quran and religion as our first source of knowledge. And he has lots of experimentation. His books of optics has many experimentations to find out more detail about the world using analogical reasoning.
Yeah.
Like between reflection of light and the reflection of material. Like, so I think that we should also focus on this third.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much.
Completes the whole picture of what happened there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, thanks for pointing this out. I will definitely look at it. I haven't really engaged with Haytham yet, but that's definitely a good point. Thank you.
I should add that mainly you can feel that they are not evangelists. They believe in causality.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe it's a tradition that is not the mainstream.
Yeah.
And could act as a serious opposition to Kalam.
Very interesting. Thank you.
First, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very clear and very interesting. I myself am not a philosopher, but an amateur. So, but if something they say is incorrect. If I understand you correctly, you say that Avicenna used the Aristotelian methods of empirical ways and evidence from experimenting to justify things in the theological and philosophical grounds, and that other philosophers thought that things should not be understood in empirical ways. There was also this debate was also in the Greek philosophy. There is this famous painting of Aristotle and Plato, in which Plato points up and Aristotle points down. So my question is, did those other philosophers who thought that you can explain the world or God just by reasoning and not by experiments or observation, could they use arguments from Plato's work or from other Greek philosophers that came before Aristotle?
Well, thanks first for the question.
Or did they object totally, if I understand it correctly, or did they totally object to Greek philosophy and say it is foreign and we should count one beyond the Quran?
Yeah. Okay. So maybe so I get correctly what you're trying to say. So what I meant is that the early philosophers, and I mentioned the name, sorry, early Islamic philosophers, and I mentioned Al-Kindi, who came before Ibn Sina, they felt like, no, they didn't just feel it, they had to defend their activity and their engagement with Greek philosophy against other Muslims, fellow Muslims, who were opposed to it because they considered philosophy foreign. So they said we shouldn't engage with something that comes from these foreign nations. All we need is the religious texts like the Quran and what the Prophet did. So that's what I meant. So it wasn't other philosophers who rejected the Greek tradition. That's what I understood you were saying, but that's not what I meant. But so with Plato, you know, I don't know how many texts by Plato they had at their disposal.
Very few.
Very few, yeah, exactly. So I think they knew some ideas, and then especially through this whole Neoplatonic tradition and so on. But I think Plato himself didn't really play an important role for them, right? It was really more Aristotle than a Neoplatonic tradition.
In Tasawwuf, in mysticism.
Yeah, they had played.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is also not all of these Greek texts actually came down to the Muslim thinkers. They translated some of them, but definitely not everything. Yeah.
Yes, I think it would be a good time to thank our speaker again and invite every week. You are all invited to join us to the Fugas for a first drink on the Institute.